We're going to move on to our next speaker here. Our next speaker is Chris McDonald. He is the Inland and Desert Natural Resources Advisor with UCC San Bernardino, Imperial, Riverside, and San Diego counties. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm the Natural Resources Advisor for Cooperative Extension in Southern California. And today I'm talking about grasslands in Southern California. Here we go. So our Southern California grasslands look very similar to grasslands found all over the world. Grasslands are pretty easy to identify. You kind of know you're standing in a grassland. Unlike some of our other communities like coastal sage scrub or chaparral that you might find in Southern California. Yeah, you kind of know when you're in a grassland. It's pretty easy. So kind of focusing on the map of grasslands in Southern California here, we don't really have that many compared to the northern parts of the state where there's, tens and thousands of acres of grasslands. And our grasslands tend to be mostly scattered. We do have two types, being that we have kind of the desert grasslands and the Mojave and Sonoran. And I'm pretty much going to ignore those for the purpose of this talk and audience. And the desert grasslands I'm referring to are like the Guyetta grasslands, the Hilaria. I'm going to be focusing more on our inland grasslands, not the desert grasslands. Well, I kind of want to point out here that our grasslands kind of come in a different flavor than in Northern California. Southern California is hotter, drier, and we get a very strong, consistent fall, winter wind in the Santa Anas than in Northern California. And so our grassland plants experience less consistent soil moisture, and there's more drought stress. And this kind of relates to having, like I said, a different flavor of grasslands in Southern California. Our dominant weeds in our grasslands are ripgut and red brome, wild oats, tocolote, also known as Malta star thistle, storkbill or phyllories, wild barleys like hordeums, black mustard, short-potted mustard. And we do not have very much cheatgrass, yellow star thistle, the tall lepidiums like perennial pepperweed or tall whitetop. We hardly have any medusa head in Southern California. We have even less barbed goat grass. And adjacent to our grasslands, we have very little French and Scotch brooms. So while many of you are kind of focused on those weeds in the previous talks that preceded me, we just don't have a lot of those weeds. And part of that's just because they haven't got here yet. And part of that's because it's just not the right climate for those weeds to really thrive in Southern California. I'm going to spend a good chunk of time talking about the three different kinds of grasslands that we have in Southern California. And I'm kind of using colloquial terms for these three different types of grasslands that we have in Southern California. I think we have grasslands that shouldn't be grasslands. We have grasslands that probably weren't grasslands. And then we have grasslands that definitely are grasslands. So grasslands that shouldn't, grasslands that weren't, and grasslands that are. So what I mean by this, because I'm sure if we were at a live audience, a couple of you'd be raising your eyebrows now. So grasslands that shouldn't be grasslands. These are plant communities that used to be dominated by something else, and they're now dominated by exotic annual grasses. A great example of this is desert scrub that's been invaded quite heavily in many parts of the Mojave and the Sonoran by red brome. And it turns into a desert grassland, especially once it burns. So you get this fine continuous fuel layer that didn't used to historically be there. All of these desert shrubs will burn and they'll die. They have a really high mortality after fire, and it quite quickly and easily converts into a desert grassland. The other example of this type of a grassland that shouldn't be is something like coastal sage scrub out in the background of this picture here. And the foreground, there's been a fire, and it gets invaded by ripgut or oats or wild barley or sometimes even red brome, and it converts into like an inland or foothills exotic grassland as well. And I do want to point out that in Southern California, this annual grass invasion into these shrublands and the conversion can happen with or without fire. It definitely happens a lot quicker, with fire and with repeated fire. But even in areas that haven't burned in a long time, we can still get these shrublands converting into annual grassland. So these are kind of grasslands that shouldn't be. Next, I want to focus a little bit on grasslands that weren't. These are plant communities that were likely not grasslands, but were misclassified as historic grasslands. So oftentimes in our grasslands in Southern California, there's so little native vegetation left on these grasslands, it can be in the high 90% of exotic plant cover, that we really don't have a good idea of what used to grow there in historic times. Rich Minnick, in his book, California's Fading Wildflowers, goes through a really deep dive into this exercise. And he uses the diaries of early Spanish explorers and others to highlight numerous observations of wildflowers in the winter and spring in Southern California. And he talks about, and he goes through these examples of flower fields and pastures that are very flowery, flower-strewn prairies, fields, groves, and valleys full of flowers. And oftentimes, currently in Southern California, we just don't see those areas. But these were relatively common back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Conversely, during the summer, when the explorers were coming through, they described dry lands. And one of their main goals was to try and introduce livestock to Southern California. And they described areas with little pasture, and they didn't describe them with green with perennial bunch grasses. So if we did have like a 20% perennial bunch grass cover in some of these areas historically, then I would expect them, and Minnick also expects them to have described them at least with some summer pasture. And they described it with, as relatively barren. And same thing during the Spanish land grant period. Again, areas were described as barren valleys, like in the example of Rancho Temecula. So these grasslands that weren't, they historically were likely not grasslands in Southern California, but were misclassified as historic grasslands by modern ecologists and botanists, partially because there's just so few native plants left in these areas. And I suspect that perennial grasses were probably not the dominant herbaceous plant type. It was probably some sort of a mixed component with wildflowers as a main component that's currently been invaded by ripgut and red brome, as well as oats and the barleys. And we kind of also classify these as inland or foothill exotic annual grasslands. So the alternative model for these areas is that they were historic grasslands and they have been invaded. So in the textbook on California grasslands, on page 3, there's a great quote: "The annualization of the California flora is reflected in California's grassland communities, many of which have been converted from perennial to annual dominance." So I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm just saying that at least in parts of Southern California, there's at least strong historical evidence to suggest that these weren't converted from perennial to annual dominance. They probably were dominated by annuals in historic times. So they weren't grasslands in Southern California in some of these areas. They were probably more of a wildflower field with perennial, low cover of perennial grasses. And lastly, we have grasslands that are. These are the grasslands that we know exist in historical times, and they're currently existing now. And bunch grasses are a significant but often minor component in our grasslands. And just like everybody says, the big problem with our grasslands is that they're being dominated by exotic annuals. So why is this so important? Why does it matter what the history of these areas are and what happened to these sites now? So here's 2 different grasslands in Southern California. One's more coastal and one's more in the mountains, but both of them have at least 98% cover of exotic plants, and relatively little of the cover here is natives. So it's really hard to figure out what these grasslands used to be like when you have so many exotic annuals currently invading these plant communities. And just on top of that, trying to remove, 90% of the plants and trying to get something with some sort of a native flavor to it can be really, really difficult. And it's even more difficult when we have this idea of what these restoration sites should look like, and it's just not going to support the plants that we think should be growing there. I often get draft restoration plans from people in Southern California that want to try and grow something with 40, 50, sometimes even 70% perennial grass cover. And it's not a viable restoration strategy. The areas tend to be too dry to support really dense perennial grasses in some of these areas. But again, of course, it all depends on which exact area we're talking about. So kind of to throw, 3 exaggerations of what the historic California flora may have looked like. It could have been something that's a lot more wildflower dominated than dominated by the annual grasses that we currently see. And trying to figure out how much of a perennial grass cover we had is going to be difficult, but in some cases, we're probably overestimating how many perennial grasses we had. So getting on to more of the nuts and bolts of how do we actually manage these grasslands in Southern California. One of our first tools that we can use is fire. And we talk about fire, we need to think about the whole fire regime, including frequency, intensity, size, pattern, season, and severity. Grasslands in Southern California, we know regularly burned during historic periods, both by natural and human causes. We know Native Americans were regularly burning patches to increase seed production, but we don't know the exact specifics of the fire regime that they were putting out on this land. We've lost that knowledge, and it really kind of sets us back on management as well. We do know that in Southern California, we do not often have enough fuels in our grasslands to burn annually. We also know that a well-timed fire can reduce non-native cover for 2 to 4 years, especially if you're burning before the annual grasses have started to produce seeds. And because it's drier down here, fire can be applied to the landscape at most 2 out of 3 years. So you'd have like a burn rest and a burn cycle. But more often we're burning once every 5 or so years, just because it's quite difficult to get a fire on the landscape. And given that the seed bank of most of our annual weeds is 2 to 3 years, some of them like black mustard are on the order of 5 years or longer, by itself, fire will not be sufficient to restore grassland or weed cover for long enough for the natives to establish. So while you can knock back some of your non-natives by correctly timing a fire, you can't get repeated fires long enough to reduce the seed bank of the annuals to where they will really, really plummet to levels where you can start to get your natives in there. On top of that, we have really strict air quality standards in Southern California, and this puts challenges on fires and also limits on daily fire sizes. There are exceptions, but 175 acres is one of the lines. There's also limits on our weather conditions, which happen all over the state, and they have to be conducted by somebody who actually knows what they're doing. And on top of that, we often starting in June and July, our air pollution levels usually get too high to start a prescribed fire. So most of the people who talked about prescribed fires before me were talking about June and July burns, and in most years, our air pollution's too high to actually get a June and July burn. So we're looking at April and May burns just because of that restriction. Even though I've talked about all the problems with fire, it can be a really useful restoration tool in Southern California. It's often difficult to meet our ecological objectives or match the historic fire regime under our current limitations. But it is really great as a first run vegetation management tool. It's something that can really help remove all of that litter and thatch. And so it's great as a first strategy when you're trying to restore your grasslands. And it has lots of benefits, as I mentioned some of them. So grazing in our grasslands in Southern California. Our grasslands were the earliest parts of the state to be intensively grazed during the Spanish Mission period. Even though most or many parts of Southern California are highly developed, it's really hard to imagine tens of thousands of head of cattle in Southern California. but we know we had them. We know that Irvine Ranch had 14,000 head. We know there were 3,000 head in Pomona and 5,000 in Santa Ana. And we still have quite a lot of open space in Southern California where there are options for grazing, but we only have several thousand head across all of Southern California, including the deserts. So just the historic amount of cows on the landscape was really, really high compared to what we have now. It's almost mind-bogglingly different. But we do know that grazing can reduce litter accumulation. It can decrease the cover of non-native annuals if it's well timed. You can get an increased cover of wildflowers post-grazing. It does increase bare ground, so erosion can be an issue. And it also increases the cover of unpalatable plants, both native and non-native. So it can give you a new weed invasion if you're not being careful. One of our unique problems to Southern California is that we don't have enough livestock during the growing season to go around. So we need to graze before the non-natives are starting to flower, and we need to remove them after the grasses senesce, especially to help with erosion issues and things like that. So we need somewhere for the livestock to go during the summer and winter and fall, and we don't really have that much pasture in Southern California to do that. So often our herds tend to be rotated around, or they're relatively small herds that stay on site the whole year. And on top of that, because there are so many people who are interested in grazing, because it can be applied across, dozens upon dozens of acres, there's competition between preserves for limited numbers of livestock. I've actually talked with land managers who've had sheep pulled off of their pastures and moved to a different pasture during the middle of the season, because the shepherd had a contract with another preserve and had to move the sheep off. So they were unable to meet the prescription just due to the demand placed on those sheep across the region. On top of that, our precipitation is quite variable. And so it's really difficult to get a prescribed grazing plan on the landscape for multiple years in a row. So we had good rain in 2019, horrible in 2018, good rain in 2017, and okay rain in 2016. So again, if you're looking at the past 4 years, you might only have been able to get cows or sheep or goats on the landscape 2 out of 4 years. Grazing can be very effective if managers can get the livestock. In Southern California, sheep are most often the preferred type of grazer. And it can be expensive in Southern California. Yes, you can pay to have sheep graze your landscape because you might need to haul in water, fencing, pay a shepherd, hire those sheep dogs for protection, and have the herd travel around. So it's best used infrequently. Switching over to chemicals, and Tom did a great job of kind of covering these in detail. I'm just going to kind of provide a general overview. And herbicides can be very effective at reducing non-native plant cover, and they can be used in very creative ways. So you can use herbicides to reduce your broadleaf weeds, shrubs, and some of your annual grasses while your perennial grasses are mostly affected. So that'd be using something like Milestone, or you can use its close cousin Transline, which will remove a smaller bouquet of your broadleaf weeds and some shrubs, while most of your perennial grasses are also unaffected. So these are great for restoration, rehabilitation of grasslands. Other options, like Tom mentioned, you can use grass-specific herbicides, and some of them will reduce your annual grasses, while your broadleaves and your perennial grasses, as well as your geophytes, your bulbs, are also mostly unaffected. But these do have some grazing restrictions, so please reach out to me if you think you're going to be using those in Southern California, and I can talk you through it. Or like Tom mentioned, you can use a dormant season of glyphosate to control your annuals, and your perennial grasses can be unharmed. Other options, like Tom mentioned, pre-emergent products that you could use on ungrazed pastures. You could reduce your broadleaf annuals while your annual grasses and most perennials are unaffected with something like Gallery. And if you want something more bare ground, then you're going to be switching over to something like Esplanade, where nearly all of your annuals will be controlled and most of your perennials will be uncontrolled. They'll grow as they are. And you can also do something with Dimension Gallery as well, in that type of setting where you really want, near complete annual control. So this talk all kind of boils down to setting your conservation goals and targets. You want to identify your threats to your goals. You're going to assess the multiple control techniques, several which I pointed out. You're going to develop a plan. You're going to monitor and assess your actions. And you're going to review and modify your plan. And lo and behold, you're going to have an IPM strategy, an integrated pest management strategy. Where you're working in this cycle, moving around from the top, establishing your goals, working through a plan, and reevaluating it as you go on. So what does that look like in Southern California? So maybe you want to restore your stipe to more than 10% cover, and you want to get your wildflowers up to 30% cover. Your threats might be your oats and bromes and the typical annuals we have, as well as keeping an eye on erosion. Your treatment options might be prescribed fire, grazing, herbicides. Maybe you don't have enough people for hand pulling. Maybe you can mow, but maybe you don't have any good options for biocontrol of your annual grasses. So your plan might look something like you might be able to burn it in year 1, or as an alternative, if you can't get a fire, you might mow it. Then for the next year or 2, you might get sheep out on your landscape to try and graze down, because it's really hard to get 2 fires in a row in Southern California. Then at the same time, you might be doing spot treatments for some of your annual grasses and weeds, especially those ones that are unpalatable to sheep. You might be collecting native plant seed for in the years 3 and 4 of this project, and then seeding that out in year 4 and 5 and monitoring the whole site. And so it's kind of a quick way of how this talk kind of boils into a plan that you might implement. So wrapping this all up, there's several different types of grasslands in Southern California, and nearly all of them are dominated by exotic annuals, but you need to be cautious about what type of plant community you're trying to restore to in these invaded grasslands, because what you think might be a viable restoration strategy might not actually be able to be supported based on the limitations of your site. So most of our options for management in Southern California are difficult to implement. And due to these challenges, we often have to use multiple tools, because it's really difficult to get fire on the landscape multiple years, livestock on the landscape for multiple years. So your best approach is to use an IPM strategy and work adaptively and think on your toes. And with that, here's my email, and I'll take any questions if we have any, and if I have any time left. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Chris. We do have one question in the Q&A here. Is there value in seeding after a prescribed fire, or just let the native seed bank germinate?
So it depends on how high the cover of your annual grasses have been. So there's been sites in Southern California that have burned, and they've had, well over 90% exotic annual grass cover for decades. And when they've burned, they've gotten absolutely no flush of the wildflower seed bank. There weren't any wildflower seeds left in the seed bank to germinate. But in other areas where we do have more of, some of a mixed setting, where you might only have like 70% of your exotic annual grasses, but 10 to 20% wildflower cover, then yeah, you might be better off leaving it to have some of those wildflowers come up on their own. But oftentimes in Southern California, we have so many annual grasses, exotic annual grasses, that the wildflower seed bank is really, really minimal, and we do have to add wildflower seeds, which get to be really expensive really quick.
Okay, thank you, Chris. There's one more question, but in the interest of time, I'll have you answer that afterwards, and I'm going to go ahead and launch your poll.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, everyone should be able to see the poll now, so if everyone could respond, and then we'll give Chris a chance to address the results. Okay, maybe a second or two. Looks like most folks have answered. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. All right. Can everyone see? Chris, can you address the questions?
Okay, looks like everybody pretty much got the right answers here. Yeah, it's difficult to get a prescribed fire in Southern California, but it can definitely be worth it. And yeah, we definitely need to use a variety of techniques, an IPM program to restore our grasslands in Southern California, because it's just so difficult to get these single treatments for multiple years. We often have to switch around and use multiple tools, which does take a lot of work for our land managers. And I understand that it is difficult to switch from fire to grazing to herbicides. But thanks.
All right. Thank you, Chris.